Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely fascinating work of history. This author is also a scholar and a lawyer and does so many interesting things that I am so excited to talk about. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Bratspies. I am a professor of law at CUNY School of Law. And in my spare time, I sort of cosplay as a historian. I wrote this book about the history of New York, but I just want to be clear, I am not a historian. So I have sort of a beginner's eye that I bring to history, and I ask questions that uh, I would encourage all of you to ask, like, who's my street named after? What did they do? Why is the street named after them? Who is the name on that building, and what does that tell us about the city that we all live in and love?
I love that, way to characterize your work here. And I think that that lines up very nicely with what I understand to sort of be the origin of this project. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about, how looking at the street names of New York City went from being a hobby to a book project. At what point did it occur to you that this might be something people wanted to read?
Well, it became something that people wanted me to stop telling them all the time. And so I would hear from people, you should write a book. And while that was somewhat flattering, I think it was also, you know what, we're stuck in traffic, and could you just shush for a couple of minutes? And that's really where the book started, getting stuck in traffic on the Major Deegan Expressway. And I should say that my parents live in Pennsylvania, and to visit them, I need to drive because they don't live anywhere where you can get through public transit, which makes me crazy, but it is what it is. And um, I live in Queens, need to get to the George Washington Bridge to get out of the city to get to Pennsylvania. And there are two ways to go, the Major Deegan or the FDR Drive. After a while, I figured out FDR was a way better way to go, but I used to be stuck on the Major Deegan because of Yankees, because of backup at the George Washington Bridge, because of flooding, because it was Tuesday, who knows why. And I would always just be so frustrated. And I would say, who was that Major Deegan? I hate him. But it turns out nobody knew who the guy was. Everybody knows who George Washington was, but nobody had a clue who Major Deegan was, even though this major right? This very significant road in New York was named after him. So it sort of got me curious. And my family got sick of me saying, who was this guy? And they're like, well, why don't you find out? So I did. And it turned out that he was a whole lot less impressive than you might expect, given that the road that goes by Yankee Stadium and connects with the George Washington Bridge was named after him. But that made me start thinking, well, who are all these other people we named the roads after, the bridges after, the buildings after? Why?
Yeah, it is a really productive use of time sitting in traffic, I think. And as somebody who lived for a very brief time, I lived in Inwood, like right around like 203rd and Broadway.
Mhm.
So I also spent a lot of time in traffic on the Major Deegan. And it was like working my way through this book was a really nice way to sort of not only revisit the history of New York, but also of my own life as a New Yorker, because these were street names that I've been like intimately familiar with since I was a child. And so getting to revisit those memories while also kind of learning the context and all that was really fascinating.
Yeah, and it turns out they're all really interesting people, even though there's this whole cohort that I sort of call bureaucrats with roads. They're middle management white guys who were in close proximity to Robert Moses, and so they have things named after them, not because they're and Major Deegan was sort of one of those in that category. I mean, really interesting guy, but hardly the stuff that you expect, roads to be named after.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned Robert Moses because his name appears a lot here. And even like he was transformational for Long Island as
Hmm.
well, for better or for worse. And given that I think it was recently or will be an anniversary of the Robert Caro book, it's been being
Yeah.
about a lot lately. I'm really curious if you could talk a little bit about his role, and also maybe if that is that where the sort of overlap between your interest here in the history of New York overlaps with your interests in like environmental justice and human rights? Because that all seems super relevant.
It is all super relevant. And that one lesson I really took from this book is that we're all asking the same questions. We're just using different language and maybe different analytical tools. But if you live in New York City and you want the city to be a better place, or you don't live in New York City, you live anywhere and you want the place that you live to be better, fairer, less polluted, more friendly to everybody, then you're asking the same set of questions about why do we have these roads that you can't get across? And why are they all cutting through neighborhoods of color? And why is there no public transit? Or why is the public transit really inconvenient to use? And why are the supermarkets where they are? And, why are the power plants where they are? It's a whole host of questions that are about decisions that sometimes are being made now, sometimes were made a long time ago, but about which places mattered and which people mattered. And we see that reflected in the names we give things as much as in where we locate the desirable infrastructure, like the parks and the pools and the good schools, and the undesirable infrastructure, like the waste transfer stations and the power plants and the highways. Um, and, where are roads part of a neighborhood and where are roads for getting through a neighborhood? These are all questions about environmental justice, but they're also all questions about city planning. And in New York, for good or for ill, that means they're questions about Robert Moses.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really interesting lens on the history of New York and the people who were either integral in that history or
Yeah.
were, thought to be at certain times.
Right.
And it's certainly a lot of new names to learn. I'm curious about, because as a former academic myself, one of the hardest things that I always found was, the killing your darlings. Like, what research do you leave out? There are
Right.
so many names, so many streets. How do you then process all that research and how do you structure it and how do you select, the stories you want to tell?
Well, to be honest, I have probably enough people to fill one or two more books. By the way, my book is much shorter than The Power Broker.
Yes.
Um, but it was really very difficult. I mean, just to give you a list of the people that I cut from the book is Jacob Javits in the Javits Center, Alexander McDougall, fascinating guy. The Murrays, right? And they had from Murray Hill fame, right? They had a complex relationship with Alexander McDougall, Jonas Bronk, who the Bronx is named after, Van Cortlandt, Hester Leeser, who the Hester Street is named after. Like, there's so many people that could have been in this book instead of the people who are in this book. And it would have been both a different and very similar, I think, slant on New York history, because the people that I wound up writing about and the people that I didn't wind up writing about, for the most part, could have been interchanged without changing that much about the story, because it is a story of the elite in government and the elite in society that have things named after them. I would add that that is changing. It is changing with street renamings and co-namings, and in particular, the now that when a street is renamed or co-named, you don't have to change the official city map. There's a really healthy and vibrant move to name corners and streets and blocks after people who are locally important. And I think that's really interesting for telling a much wider story about who makes New York.
Mm, absolutely. And this is in many ways, I think, a surprisingly diverse story at times. We've mentioned a lot of the sort of the great white men who things are
Mhm.
normally named after, but there's also it's very diverse in terms of race and culture and gender and sexual orientation. So yeah, could you talk about like maybe some of the like were there overarching trends in naming that you saw that align with different periods? And when did it start to
Mhm.
get more inclusive?
So it's actually really interesting to see the iteration of how things are named over time. So the earliest names that we have are either the indigenous names for places, or the names of the indigenous people that the white settlers gave to places like Canarsie, Massapequa, names like that. But they're also like Manhattan, obviously, is a clear example of right a name that predates the Dutch or the English for the island. But then things were named for the white settlers who owned them. So that's how we get Van Cortlandt Park from the Van Cortlandt estate. We get Murray Hill. We get Lenox, Lenox Hills. I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. But you know that neighborhood, um, Willis Point. You know, we get all of these neighborhoods that are named sometimes for somebody who was really important. Like the Lennoxes were a really significant family that was deeply involved in the history in many ways of New York City and New York State. But we also get people like Willits, who just happened to be the owner of the land whose name stuck. Rikers Island is named after the Riker family. One thing that I found really interesting, and I tried to make a point of learning, was who was involved with the slave economy and who wasn't. And that is a slice of New York history that I think we've really obscured.
Mm.
How much of the wealth and prominence of figures that we know as names on parks and buildings came from labor that was stolen from enslaved people. And how much of the infrastructure, like Gracie Mansion, was built by enslaved labor. For the longest time, that was not really part of the story of the mansion. It is now in I think more important ways. And one of the other things I found really interesting was when you look for it, you can find queer history in New York as long as there has been New York. Because of course there have been queer people as long as there have been people, but finding that history is more difficult. A couple places where I found it that I think are interesting is that right, Bryant Park is named after William Jennings Bryant, who was a great abolitionist and an author and a really significant figure in both literature and politics in the United States. Well, his aunt, a woman named Charity, was in a lifelong relationship with a woman named Sylvia Drake that at the time, during his lifetime, Bryant described as a marriage. Similarly, Gertrude Whitney, who founded the Whitney Museum, it was an important sculptor, but an even more important patron of the art, really shaped the Ashcan School of Art, among other things. Right? She, as a young woman, had a very passionate love affair with another woman that her parents immediately married her off to a guy that she basically had nothing in common with. But she was madly in love with this woman, Esther Hunt, who was the daughter of the architect Richard Morris Hunt, who designed many of the Vanderbilt houses and buildings and also designed the Lenox Library. So, all these people, their lives were intertwined in these interesting ways.
Yeah, it's really lovely to see, I think, through the street names, you sort of get to experience like almost like an archaeology of names. Like you can see the different layers of history and how they all interact. And it gives, I think it really emphasizes the way that history is still alive in New York City. Because obviously lots of stuff has been rebuilt, but there are so many different layers of just time periods existing next to each other. You've already talked about so many interesting stories. Was there something that surprised you the most or that has stuck with you the most poignantly?
Two things that really surprised me. First of all, the Outer Bridge crossing is named after a guy named Outerbridge. Um, I just assumed it's the outermost bridge. I think everybody, if they don't think about it, assumes, well, it's the outer bridge because it's out there, right? But it's named after a guy named Eugenius Outerbridge, who was instrumental in founding the Port Authority. He came from a Bahamian family and immigrated to the United States. Another thing you see here is how many of these central figures were immigrants, right, coming to this country and doing incredible things. Another thing that really stunned me is the justification for pretty much every single road, bridge, or piece of infrastructure that we now treat as synonymous with congestion was built with the expressed intention of reducing congestion. So you'd think we would learn something. It's been, a century and a half of we're going to reduce congestion by building this road or this bridge or, this other road, and it has never worked.
It is a very human story in that way that we don't always learn from everything what we should. Yeah, I was absolutely surprised by the outer bridge as well. I thought that was a purely descriptive name, and it was a very funny surprise. What do you think when you look at the history of a city through this lens? What special view do you think it gives you? Is it a look into a city's values, its politics, its aspirations, all those things? Like, what is the unique thing that you get from looking at a city this way?
Well, I do think you get all of those things in a way that you don't always get from a more conventional approach to history. And like I said, I'm an amateur. So, the order of the names in the book, you look at it and you're like, I'm sure that makes sense somehow. But really it was like, I divided it up by kind of infrastructure, just because it seemed like a good organization, but it's not intellectually defensible, nor is the who's in, who's out. Yeah. So, I mean, I really think what I tried to do was to really capture the people and the complexity of their lives. And to me, that's inherently interesting because people are really interesting. And all of the people in the book, the good ones, the bad ones, the corrupt ones, the mean ones, the generous ones, but they were all really interesting. And I think that gives us a way of thinking about history that reminds us that people are people. And, the world changes, but people don't necessarily. And that is to me both terrifying and comforting. And like, it matters to me that during the American Revolution, Kosciuszko, who was a brilliant military strategist, was an ardent abolitionist. You don't have to say, well, we're looking back at slavery from 21st century morals to condemn it. You can say it was clear at the time to a lot of people who looked that this was a terrible, immoral thing. And, and like a lot of these people did amazing things.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to learn about figures that were clearly important in their times, but maybe don't have the same name recognition factor anymore as other people. And to an earlier point, like I think that it's also a really interesting look into kind of the nature of that, the immigrant history of New York. I also lived in Greenpoint in Brooklyn for a time, and all of the street names there were Polish. And you can really see the influence of the people who settled there, or like, the Italian and Chinese enclaves on the Lower East Side. It's a very much like a glimpse into the past, but one that is still very much alive.
And, really, and sort of both the past and the present. I mean, it's not really direct present at this point, but both the Kosciuszko Bridge and the Pulaski Bridge, right? They were named after Polish immigrants who were very important military figures during the Revolutionary War. Both of those bridges were named in 1940, very soon after the Nazis rolled into Poland. And the naming of them was extremely political. It was a vote in favor of a world that wasn't fascist. And, all the speeches around the namings make that very, very clear. So, naming is both really personal, but also really political. And of course, now names are for sale. We don't have Shea Stadium anymore. We have, Citigroup. We have It's really a very different way of thinking about naming when you sell naming rights. And I actually wrote an essay about CUNY, where I teach, about the evolution from naming things either functionally, like Queens College and Brooklyn College, to naming them honorifically, like Lehman College and Baruch College and LaGuardia, to selling naming rights, which is how many of the new schools are being named. And what that says as well about the society that we live in. And I don't know why I said Citigroup instead of Citi Field. I apologize.
That's right. Yeah, but it's a really interesting look at how names can be civic memorials. They can be sort of works of public art, or it can be a billboard, which is a little less exciting to me. So
But the fact that we change, right, that we flip back and forth between those states of descriptive, honorific, and for sale, I think is very interesting.
Totally. Yeah, there's so much here. And I think that this is, a really great gift for New Yorkers, especially those who are proud of being New Yorkers and who are interested in that history. Because I think it speaks to the history of all New Yorkers in a way. And gosh, it's just such a pleasure to talk to you about it. Do you think you will write another book about the city? Is there anything you want to do with all of that stuff you had to cut out of the first?
I don't know. It just occurred to me that I don't even know if I said the name of the book. It's called Naming Gotham: The Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York Place Names. I have been writing a lot of blog posts about parts that didn't get into the book. I'm sort of on a one-woman campaign to try to get the Queens Midtown Tunnel renamed for Jane Matilda Boleyn, who is the first Black woman to serve as a judge in the United States. And for the first 25 years she was a judge, she was the only Black woman to serve as a judge in the United States. Really interesting woman. She and her husband were both lawyers. He worked for the Treasury Department in DC, and they had a commuter marriage back in like LaGuardia's era, right? LaGuardia appointed her. She had a kid and then went back to work. Really just a fascinating woman. And she was an inspiration for many of the women judges who followed her. Constance Baker Motley, who was the first Black woman appointed to be a federal judge, relied on her a lot for advice. She's just super interesting, and nothing has been named after her yet.
That's an extremely worthy campaign, and I will direct people to the blog in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time to share your book with our listeners.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. All right, listeners, here's that name again. Check out Naming Gotham: The Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York Place Names. It is a beautiful gift for your favorite New Yorker, or for yourself if you feel like you need a little pick-me-up. It is a beautiful, beautiful book, and I don't think you will regret it. Okay, it is time to close this chapter. We will see you next time. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.